Hello everyone, and welcome on this lovely afternoon. So with great appreciation that you're here. I'm Holly Schaefer, a professor in the History of Art and Architecture department.
Yeah, and I'm Finian Garrity, and I teach in religious studies, South Asian studies, and contemplative studies.
And we're both really thrilled to welcome you here today for our workshop on crafting cuisine, which is a celebration of food and art in South Asia. And just one piece of kind of logistics is that our workshop today will have two parts. The first part will be talks by our wonderful speakers who will be introducing in due course. And then we'll divide into groups in order to do 3 different making projects, which we'll also discuss with you when the time comes for that moment. But we wanted to start just by introducing you to this theme of crafting cuisine. In Sarah K. Khan's Cookbook of Gestures, and Sarah is with us today, the cookbook is at once the act of cooking and the artistry of the cook's hands, their gestures, the fist in the filling, the hand cup to measure the water, its turn to draw the dough into form, and on, till the sweets are lined up in neat rows to bake. How does food make art happen? And in turn, how does artistry make food happen? Sometimes there is a literal, even mundane, connection between food and art, as both can be seen as crafts, whose artists often depend on recipes, techniques, processes, where even the ingredients and methods between them can overlap. Sometimes food is art, and it makes one attentive to so many other ephemeral arts, like music and dance, as well as the arts that have been made to contain or protect foods, like platters and textiles, rosewater bottles, and wine cups, and those spaces built to experience dining and create community. In turn, art can represent food, as so many lush images inform us that people really like to look at food. And I'm sure there are many of us in this audience here who are in that category. From the raw produce to cooked dishes, people eating food, and partying in any number of settings, gardens, palaces, streets. And learn from its production how to eat, what to eat, how to make, and also what is out of reach. What is hunger, desire, longing? Our 5 presenters today will explore many of these themes and questions through recipes, textiles, ceramics, and illustrated books, with a prompt that aims to draw together the present with the past. How does making impact how we understand history? How can we use our hands, appetites, and kitchens to learn more about the foods and arts of different places, cultures, and times?
Thanks, Holly. And please don't be shy. Come on in, find a seat. Well, wonderful to have everyone here today. As we turn to our presenters to consider these questions that Holly has raised, I just want to pause for a second to reflect on what it means to study, teach, and learn about food and art. Because in many ways, learning is intrinsic to gastronomic and artistic pursuits. Selection of ingredients, oral traditions, recipe books, cooking technologies, the culinary imaginary. All of these involve the transmission of knowledge about food and art. And this transmission is also transformative, right? Food and art, reanimated by new ideas, experiences, and makers, are reshaped in this process. And so, if you'll indulge me, I just wanted to share a memory about one of the greatest lessons that I've ever been taught about food and culture. And my teacher stood right here, in fact, 5 years ago. She was not a professor. She was the legendary author, chef, and actress, Mother Joffrey, who many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. And she visited our class back then on food, religion, and politics, and gave a talk in this space. And so I bring it up now because I recall the Q&A when a student raised the notion of authenticity, a deeply contested idea that is of great relevance to food as much as it is to art. In her talk, Madhur acknowledge the fluidity of culture that I have just alluded to, right? The way that culture changes even as it is preserved. And at the same time, she talked about the venerability of tradition, the way certain cultural forms, like a family recipe or a treasured painting, can serve as touchstones of identity and thus authenticity. What is authentic food? The student asked. And silence, just like that right now. And I'll always remember how deftly and authentically Mother Jaffrey formulated her reply. Authentic food, she intoned, is food from home. And I bring this up now to remind you that our own personal experiences with food and art are deeply relevant here and welcome here. And I'm really looking forward to the Q&A that will follow each of our presentations so that we can get your input. And on behalf of the Saxena Center and the Art History Department and Brown as a whole, we just want to extend a special welcome to the students from our classes who are here today. Your presence is so vital to these conversations. So thanks again for coming. So without further ado, maybe I should introduce our first presentation and speakers. And as I said, we'll have brief talks that are followed by short opportunities for Q&A, and we'll do those in sequence. And our presenters are Andrea Gutierrez and Deepa Reddy. Andrea teaches at the University of Texas at Austin in the Department of Asian Studies. She uses Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Tamil languages to conduct research on projects concerning the food history of South Asia and animal studies for the region. Andrea's recently published on medieval temple food in the Journal of Hindu Studies and on medieval captive elephant training, elephant education, linguistic articulation, or punishment, among other things. Gutierrez is presently preparing a book manuscript with the working title, Royal Pleasures, Recipes and Dining in India's History. And I really look forward to that for my classes. Deepa S. Reddy is a cultural anthropologist with the University of Houston Clear Lake. She is tenured faculty and now working part-time from India since 2000. Her book, Religious Identity and Political Destiny, was published with Rowman and Littlefield. She's part of an editorial collective that's curated a volume on public expressions of Hinduness, public Hinduisms. And recently she has been a co-investigator on an NIH-funded project to understand Indian and Hindu perspectives on genetic variation research. And she's now the lead researcher for the Asthma Files, a global multi-city study of air quality and environmental governments in cities around the world, including 6 in India. And she's also published on the Indian women's movement, caste politics, and religious nationalism, as well as on Indian and Hindu perspectives on human genetic variation, biopolitics, and constructions of the civic. And Andrea and Deepa have this amazingly generative collaboration that they've been kind enough to share with me and now with you, where they'll say more about this, but they're working together to kind of bring to life and reimagine pre-modern food recipes and cuisine, and so forth. So their presentation is entitled Nala as a Mirror on Buttermilks. Andrea, Deepa, welcome.
Thank you so much, Finn, and to our organizers, and to students, and all attendees here. Can everyone hear me okay? At least a few. So, I'll present the first half, and then my collaborator will be joining us. So, good afternoon. I am mostly a medievalist, and I work on texts. Yes, but I also cook, obviously. When I'm working on culinary history, literally cooking while I translate recipe collections, it might seem obvious to cook as you go, right? Despite practical challenges. How will I choose what I'm going to cook, though, out of hundreds of recipes in every single collection, even if I have the time and access to ingredients? What will I choose to recreate in this methodology that we call experimental archaeology? Will I cook what sounds feasible, or will I cook something that the humans I live with might be willing to eat for dinner? I should tell you that historical recipes often literally leave things out in the transcription in writing them down. So I know I obviously need to add salt for a lot of recipes, which is only sometimes mentioned. But what about other spices? What spices are really implied when Nulla, one cookbook author we'll be looking at, writes that the cook needs to add in a spice blend? Right? What are these spices? How can we fill in the blanks in the kitchen? A lot is left unsaid, right? So obviously experience is key here, but modern experience of the varied cuisines of countless communities of South Asia cannot substitute for experience of the historical culinary record, right? And we also just can't infer from the present and read back into the past, right? As we all know. Sometimes recipes do translate intelligibly in linguistic terms, meaning I understand the words, I can figure out a translation, which is not always the case either, but I do lack context to figure out what this dish was really supposed to be even, right? Some of these recipe collections won't have names for dishes at all, so I have to do the guesswork and figure out what something is, what is going on. And so my point about translating or reading recipes in a book versus cooking them aims to illustrate differences between intellectual and experiential knowledge. The experiential is gained through practice, through repetition, through direct observations, repeated efforts, memory of past experience. We might understand this better through our senses, things like smelling or feeling the consistency. For those who are going to join for the demo workshop portion, we'll see how does the yogurt smell if it's not produced in industrial settings? How will non-dairy ferments affect the taste, smell, texture, right? There's a lot going on there that we need to experience to understand. We might also experiment with replicating a dish to figure out what is missing in a recipe. But it could also be something missing in my experimental setup, right? As I try to cook in the kitchen. What else would a medieval chef have done that is not indicated in the writing? There's a lot that we don't know, right? So despite all these imperfections in the replication process, cooking these dishes can still bring us closer to experiencing what is otherwise intangible cultural heritage of the sort that UNESCO has been promoting around the world, especially for traditional cultures in the arts, oral traditions as well, forms of technologies and techniques that are at risk of being lost over time through progress or globalization, war, and all of these things. And so, for the sake of time, I'm going to only elaborate on 2 points before I pass this on to my co-presenter. And one is why Dr. Reddy and I chose Buttermilks for our collaborative project. We could have looked at any other type of dishes, right? Any set of dishes. We could have looked at dals, cooked rice preparations, desserts, meats, and so on. So why buttermilks? Of course, seasoned buttermilks are consumed across South Asia today, but all of the various buttermilks from so many different communities obviously reflect regional specificity and community local specificity as well. So variations might be indicative of a certain place or community where a preparation would be from. So we may get other clues when we don't know the provenance of a text, for example. A Rajasthani kadhi, as you see, will be very different from a Gujarati kadhi, which is different from a Majige huli from Karnataka, and so on, right? And so we will learn something through these minor variations, minor or major, as the case may be. And so it turns out that a number of coincidences concerning buttermilk arose in particular for one cookbook collection, recipe collection, Nulla's Mirror on Cooking, a medieval text that I've been studying, so we decided to pursue this. And so what are these coincidences? Nulla's Mirror on Cooking is not a complete book. It drops off in the middle of a chapter on yogurts, and the last chapter that we were promised by our narrator in the beginning of the book was supposed to be on the buttermilks, but is completely missing from this text. So what happened to this missing content in this book? Upon closer reading of this text, I have discovered that this cookbook in the received version that we have today has been re-edited and reorganized sometime after its original composition. And so we actually do find buttermilk preparations that should have been in this missing chapter. We find those much earlier in the text, in this hugely disproportionately large first chapter of the book. And so we have some reordering of buttermilk content. But there's more. In my research on other recipe collections, I've found additional missing recipes for buttermilks that actually belong to this Nullah's Mirror cookbook. I found them in a totally different later royal text. And so this is more missing content, and they are buttermilk and butter recipes that are not retained in what is the present version of the text of Nullah's Mirror on Cooking. And so somehow this was lost in the shuffle. Material on buttermilk kept coming back to me in relation to Nullah's cookbook as I read along. And so finally, the Nullah, as you're going to see some images from Dr. Reddy, the Nullah in this cookbook was a legendary figure and hero from the Indian epic Mahabharata. In the epic, Nullah was a very famous cook, and he continues to be represented this way in the later all sorts of cultural manifestations coming out of pop culture of India and so on. And so we find mentions of Nullah and his instructions on cooking in all sorts of texts, all sorts of disciplines. Other books cite Nullah as the author of recipes, including books from Ayurveda, medical sciences. And so we find that one medieval commentary, let's see where we are, one medieval commentary on one medical text records recipes as Nullahs, specifically, right? And these just happen to be seasoned buttermilk dishes, cuddy dishes, right? So this was all too much, too many coincidences for me, all across discipline, genre, and time. And so I said, let's focus on this, right? What's going on here? All of these intersections made me propose to Dr. Reddy that we try to prepare some of these buttermilk dishes to see what's going on, right? Are the ones we don't know the actual location of composition for Nullah's Mirror on cookbook, nor an exact time. So I thought it might help us try to pinpoint a location. We're only partway through our collaboration anyway, so we've got more work to go. But my second point that I want to make here is to think what might be gained by cooking medieval recipes, right? And so I'll give one illustration of how making dishes in my own kitchen confirmed arguments that I had arrived at through textual study of these cookbooks. One argument of mine is that a recipe collection, a different recipe collection that I list first here, like what we find in the 12th century Delight of the Mind, is very different in its purpose and its intent, and different in how the cookbook or the recipes would have been used, right, as a consultation source. Very different uses from the Nullah's Mirror on cookbook that I've been talking to you so far, right? So Nullah's Mirror is a cookbook that is written as a courtly entertainment. Yes, of course, it also contains the practical knowledge on how to cook, right? But it's meant to be, its primary surface level goal is as entertainment. It's told as a story. Whenever there's a need to explain, why are you using these culinary techniques, or why are you using this sort of pot to serve, or this sort of vessel, let's say, then we have a narrative episode that's invented just for the cookbook to tell a story, right? And so we have the surface level goal that this cookbook would be read aloud by members of the royal court for entertainment, where amusement is a high priority, right? This is not unfamiliar to us today. For those of you who watch the Great British Bake Off, some of you in the crowd, at least a few, or the same purpose of collecting so many, let's say, coffee table cookbooks that are meant to be drooled over, right, literally. And maybe you'll cook one recipe in there once in a while, you'll try. And so, if you're wondering, Nullah's Mirror is more like this coffee table cookbook type of scheme. And so cooking recipes in my own kitchen, I was able to confirm. When I tried to replicate, you will see that Dr. Reddy's quality of photography work and her artistry and recreation is far superior to mine. When I tried to make, this is a doll here, a royal doll fit for a king. This one from The Delight of the Mind, it was very reproducible according to the instructions indicated, right? I had no troubles at all, yeah? On the contrary, on the other hand, when I tried to reproduce recipes from Nullah's Mirror on cooking, I really didn't know what to do. It left so much to the imagination. I was never quite sure, is this meant to be a dry vegetable curry? how much water do I really need to add? What is the intended artifact supposed to be when I'm making this Alessandro curry from the greens of the black-eyed pea? And so I had a sort of practical cooking, culinary-based confirmation of what I'd already arrived at through textual study, that while Nala's recipes do work, as anybody who would know how to cook would be able to use them for the time period, the primary purpose was this goal of entertaining and amusing, as I think we're going to hear about later today as well. And so Nala's recipes left almost too much to the imagination in some cases. There's a lot of assumed knowledge that I'm not privy to, and I don't know how to proceed in the kitchen. So I'm going to stop here so that I can pass over our joint presentation over to Dr. Reddy, and just thank you for listening, and that's all I have. We can link to Dr. Reddy. It's very late at night also for her, so.
I'm actually here. I may be some sort of ectoplasmic presence in that room at the moment. I'm not quite sure, but can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, all right, great. So I'm thrilled to be, well, sort of between here and there, but very grateful to Holly and Finian for this invitation and for this very, very excellent opportunity. I realized while I was being introduced that there's actually very little in my bio that has anything to do with food, which is crazy. I need to remedy that somehow, but I'll just add something that I should have put front and center for this particular session, is that I write a blog called paticherry.com, and that is all about food. And it's really that brought me together with Andrea for this particular collaboration. So anyway, I can say more about it later, but just in the interest of time, let me share my screen. Tell me when you can see my screen. Yes. Okay, all right, great. All right, so my title, Cooking Culture, is both a two-word response to the prompt that was given to us, which is how does making impact your scholarship? And it's a bit of a tip of the hat to my alma mater, Rice University, which was so driven by writing culture, the writing culture framework of the late 1990s, and for a long time after, really built around the idea that disciplinary methods make not just our scholarship, but the realities that we purport to represent. If writing is a kind of making, then so also is cooking. So let me try and give you just a whirlwind 10-minute explanation of exactly what I mean by that. Okay, here we go. I've grown up with these legendary cooks. Grandmothers, aunts, village hands trained by this person or that with their own native ingenuities. And these, of course, famously splendid cooks from the Mahabharata, King Nala and Bhima of the Pandavas. It's very interesting for me that in both these last two cases, King Nala and Bhima, we know of their cooking skills primarily when, or rather only when they are not themselves. Nala has been deformed into the dwarf called Bahuka, and Bhima must spend the 13th year of his exile incognito as Vallabha. The Nala story in particular weaves around his wife, Queen Damayanti's search for the husband from whom she has been separated. And it strikes me that in the old story, as much as in our present quest, Nala must be found. And not being himself, he must also be recognized. Now, the fact that these popular representations that you see on the screen at the moment of both Nala and Bhima show them so similarly, I mean, it almost looks like there's no difference between the one and the other, actually suggests to me that we are struggling to imagine them. We really don't know them at all. And the best we can do, apparently, is to call Bahuka the master chef of the Mahabharata, as this one restaurant in Bangalore apparently does. And then, the same restaurant proceeds to imagine the same Bahuka as a twin to Ghatotkacha, who is also a personality from the Mahabharata. But he's the Asura with the enormous appetite, who we see consuming an entire marriage feast while singing its praises. This, of course, was in the old film Maya Bazar, in the famous song Vivaha Bhojanambu. But all humor aside, we do in India genuinely believe what Anton Ego says in Ratatouille. Not everyone can become a great artist, but a great artist can come from anywhere. So now you have a sense of why Remy the Rat is sitting on my slides. And we think of the recipes of these famously good cooks from wherever they come, whether they're village grandmothers or great kings, as pathways to come into touch with them, to understand in some very deeply tactile and sensory sense their craft of cookery, even if some of it is just the magic of their hands, or what we call in Tamil, kaigunam. Cooking is a kind of epistemology. It's a way of wholly being with ingredients and plants and animals in a place, here, now. But it's also a sort of time travel, a remembering, a sort of Ersta's nostalgia, as Arjuna Padarai once said, for experiences that we've never had and places that we've never been. Recipes are a kind of starting point for an exploration of all that. What we have, of course, are mere fragments. Not only because King Nala's cookbook is centuries old, not only because what we think of as a recipe in these days of diet quantifying and SEO standardization is so different from almost the cursory indications of the old text that Andrea was gesturing to in her talk, but because a recipe is somewhere inherently and always a fragment of some wider complex of insight, knowledge, know-how, bodily praxis, and sensory conjuring that brings food in all of its different dimensions into being. Sometimes, and there's examples on the screen of, it's just a list of ingredients. Not all of them are identifiable. Sometimes the process is indicated as though it should be obvious to everybody. Sometimes it's occurred to me that it's not at all so different from how our own Indian mothers have taught us cooking, an entirely subjective, contextual, if this, then that, a little of this, a little of that type of very, very imprecise instruction. But if I dare make an analogy with the kinds of assignment instructions I give my students every semester, these can be cursory or they can be extremely detailed, and it really doesn't seem to matter. There will always be students who seek a great deal of definition and certainty, and then there will be those quote unquote wise cooks who manage to figure it out regardless. And it's really interesting to me, and I think no coincidence, that the texts like Nalapaka Darpana often call out to these wise cooks, as if to say, you must know the craft so that you can now receive instruction. You have to be okay with ambiguity, even while you make highly specific decisions. You have to think of contingency almost as a kind of practice. To the specifics, Andrea talked a little bit about why we honed in on the buttermilk recipes, and I'll have a lot more to say about buttermilk in the demo half of this workshop. So for now, just to make the point that the buttermilk that we're working with is far from what is typically sold and consumed as such in the US grocery stores. Properly, it is a byproduct of the butter churning process. And it is an invaluable, gut-rewilding, absolutely delicious thing. In nearly all Indian diets, it has a very large cultural significance. Not only as something that restores gut health, we always given doses of buttermilk after having courses of antibiotics and so on, and it's body cooling as well. But it is the thing to give away for free to wayfarers and travelers in scorching summer months. It's a sort of expression of a sort of fundamental human kindness. But in parsing the material, reading the words and correlating them with modern vocabularies and practices, and finding that historical and conceptual connective tissue has not always been straightforward. The Ayurvedic immune boosting kadha in some regions uses buttermilk, in other regions not at all. The simmering, boiling, thickening, known as kadna in Hindi, done in an open vessel, which is called a kadai, may produce curries with buttermilk, or sometimes not using buttermilk at all. Curd preparations cannot be boiled in the way that is shown in this particular image, or they will split. And yet they also can be the base for curries. So there are a lot of slippages and language fragments that still remain. But coming to perhaps the part that we both looked most forward to in this collaboration, to the 3 recipes that we selected out of several that Andrea had shared with me. This one here that you see on the screen is a fragment in another sense, because it is taken from one of the commentaries that reference Nala. So in fact, we're kind of circling around him via these recipes and trying to find him through the others that knew him, we could say. Note here that we go from the Sanskrit to the transliteration, to the translation in language, to the translation onto the table, text to plate, maybe we could call it, And of course, there are many layers of interpretation that are embedded in all of this. This particular recipe here that you see is unique, not so much for the use of pomegranate juice and peels in a savory preparation. There's actually precedent for that in contemporary Indian cuisine, but because it uses yogurt or dahi, where the use of yogurt these days in these preparations is usually a fallback because buttermilk is no longer being produced as much by individual households. In this particular case, the curd actually doesn't split on heating because of the addition of moong dal, which is itself a little bit of an unusual ingredient in this sort of a preparation. Now, I allowed myself a little bit of interpretive latitude here by using a small quantity of coconut, both for taste and for thickening. This isn't an innovation particularly. It's not even, taking creative license, but it is an idea that is borrowed from an allied preparation that is known as the tambuli in coastal and highland Karnataka, which, like many of the medicinal karas, uses small amounts of wild and often medicinal ingredients with coconut, green chilies, and yogurt, and is eaten, like the buttermilk preparations, with hot rice. It's also body cooling, famously so. The Tambuli's basic formulation, in this case, became a kind of framework for me to think about this pomegranate buttermilk recipe and how to bring it to life. Then we have a sesame yogurt, which you will hear more about in the demo session. And this one uses not a classic yogurt culture, but a sesame culture as a starter. Now, I've read that such sesame fermented drinks are used by farm workers in East Africa, which are regions to which sesame is native after all. Otherwise, this particular preparation is quite unusual for India. We tend to ferment with millets and cereals rather than with seeds. Andrea has commented that there's a lot of sesame in the Nalapaka Darpana, but this recipe appears only in a commentary that is attributed to Nala. So perhaps it's also an ancient interpretation of him and an imagination of his affinity for sesame or his love for it. Here's a snapshot of the process of setting sesame curd, straining out what is essentially then thin as whey in the middle picture and using that as a base for the preparation, which you see on the right. This one, I have to say, felt very special. It felt very unusual, very light, very nourishing all at the same time. The ginger, pepper, cumin taste combinations made perfect sense somehow, but the broth itself was quite unusual. Finally, we have a much more straightforward and almost immediately recognizable kadha in the Ayurvedic classic sense. This is trikatu or trikadugam, which are generally, we agree to be black pepper, dry ginger, and long pepper or pipali, a sort of medicinally potent trinity that are ground together and used to spice buttermilk. This is almost a classic kadha, specifically medicinal formulation, or mukuri as it's called in Kerala. I didn't have ketaki or screw pine flowers to aromatize, as this recipe calls for, so I used neem flowers instead, at least to be able to expand that medicinal palette. I have to say I was rather grateful for one recipe among many that could just be matched and mapped onto a more recognizable contemporary form rather than one that needed a sort of elaborate interpretation. Anyway, to sum up really quickly, cooking for me is both a methodology of scholarship that is investigative as well as experimental. It is a kind of ethnographic fieldwork in its own right. I'm an anthropologist to a fault, and it involves asking, musing, mulling, and then somewhat beyond the conventional field research models, also experimenting, testing, figuring out against only the most obscure measures, which must themselves be fathomed, did I get it right? And in that way, eventually arriving at an understanding of what a dish is and its cultural and ethnobotanical richness. It's a little bit like my son's Italian violin teacher once told me when I was struggling in this town to get tiramisu right, because the heat of this place cannot hold a cream. And I had no access to mascarpone or saviardi in those days. And he said to me, forget the mascarpone, forget the saviardi. And then you will understand the soul of the thing. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. That was so much food for thought. Sorry that I won't keep on doing that. So in the interest of time, I'm going to let's collect 3 or 4 questions, feedback, comment, and then we'll save the chance to respond from our for the breakout sessions and move along. So Any comments for Andrea and Deepa? I mean, there was so much there, so rich. But please, I want to give the floor to those of you who've come today. Please, yeah. Yeah.
You guys had a great presentation. My question was, do you guys try to source ingredients from the same local areas, or do you just go wherever is available?
So sourcing. Let me before you answer that, and I think we should keep moving ahead. We'll talk about sourcing ingredients. That's great. Other questions or comments that we can pool together? Yeah, so we can have a rich discussion as the afternoon unfolds. Yeah, please.
I'm a pretty avid cook, and so I'm wondering, like, how do you deal with, like, some of the frustrations, or maybe not frustrations, but some of those, like, that ambiguity? Like, how do you go about it, like, okay, deep breath, like, proceed, but also try to make it as authentic or as, like, true to the recipes you're making?
Great comment. Others, please, yeah.
Yeah, I had a question about the documentation and how that maybe affected the process, because it seems like these projects, these wonderfully presented projects, have maybe the same struggle as most cooking shows about how to actually convey the qualities of these foods. And I was wondering when the iPhones kind of became a primary instrument in your process, and if there's been a more deliberate approach to documenting the cooking and as well as the final outcomes.
They're so great. So technology, ingredients, ambiguity in the kitchen, and yeah, David, please.
Okay, I want to pick up on this, the comment about, appreciated this, the comment that one cannot infer past practice from present practice. But to think, in some ways, just to ask for an expansion, because in some ways that might be the only, it might be the only avenue that we might possibly use, and where do you see the value versus the risks of inferring past from present?
This is great. So whoever comes to the breakout for Buttermilk is going to have rich and fulsome answers to all these amazing questions. But so one more round of applause for Andrea. So Holly, you want to introduce the next?
Oh, I just go through, right? Oops. Yep. Thank you so much. I'm now going to introduce our next speakers, Yael Rice and Sarah K. Khan. And I'll begin with Yael. She'll be speaking first, but I'll also introduce Sarah at this moment, too. So Yael Rice is Associate Professor of Art History and of Asian Languages and Civilizations at Amherst College. She specializes in the art and architecture of South Asia, Central Asia, and Iran, with a particular focus on manuscripts and other portable arts of the 15th through 18th centuries. She is the author of the recently published The Brush of Insight, Artists and Agency at the Mughal Court, published by the University of Washington Press, which I recommend to all, as I recommend all of the books from everyone who's speaking and projects. Sarah K. Khan utilizes food to provoke thought about injustice towards people and the planet. She explores food, culture, women, migration, and identity in urban and rural environments. A maker and scholar, she uses photography, films, printmaking, maps, ceramics, and writing. A 2-time Fulbright recipient, Khan earned a BA in Middle Eastern History and Arabic from Smith College, 2 masters in public health and nutrition from Columbia University, and a PhD in traditional ecological knowledge systems, plant sciences at the New York Botanical Garden and CUNY. She has received numerous grants, fellowships, and residencies to pursue her work. Most recent ones include Anderson Ranch Residency, the Women's Studio Workshop, and Kohler Arts and Industry. Without further ado, I'm going to invite Yael, who will be speaking about eating the Book of Blessings.
Thank you for the introduction. Thanks to Holly Tiffanian for the invitation, to Grace for seamless organization of this event. It's a pleasure to be here. I wonder, is it possible to turn down the lights just a touch, but so that I could still see? Yeah, perfect, like that. Just do that. So what I'm going to do over the next 10 minutes is, in very briefly, introduce this object, this illustrated manuscript that I have spent time working on as an art historian, and have had the great pleasure and honor of also being inspired by the work of my friend and collaborator, Sarah Khan, who you'll hear from as well, and her work that has taken up this object too. So the object in question is an illustrated manuscript. It's called the Nimat Name. It is often, that is the title, translated as the Book of Delicacies, but Nimat in Arabic also can mean blessings, and that is how, in this case, I've translated it. It was completed around 1495 to 1505, so this is an approximate date. It's a fragmentary manuscript. We're missing actually the initial folios, and the latter folios are also pages through the main text that are missing as well. So if there was a date in the manuscript, if it was recorded, it's lost to us now. And in its present state, it contains 149 folios or leaves, so around 300 pages, and 50 illustrations. There probably were more illustrations than that. Most of the illustrations, like the one you see here, depict one of the manuscript's two royal patrons, and they are typically accompanied by servants and enslaved people. And these attendants typically are shown preparing concoctions and also serving these preparations to the sultans. These include dishes, edible dishes like samosas, stews, beverages, pan, or what's called tanbul, but also perfumes and lotions. And that is the case, actually, the illustration that accompanies the recipe here. It's actually for a beta leaf or pan recipe. The text itself is composed in Persian, but uses quite a few terms, vocabulary in Hindavi and in Sanskrit. So it's very much a kind of linguistic mixture or concoction too. The ingredients also, there are many ingredients listed in here. They are drawn from both locally sourced substances, from camphor to musk to betel nut, but also imported ingredients like nutmeg, which would have at this point in time only been sourced from Southeast Asia, mastic, which was only sourced from the island, Greek island of Chios. So the Nimat Name was produced for Ghiat-ad-Din Shah and his son and successor, Nasser-ad-Din Shah, who were members of the Turco-Afghan Khalji dynasty that ruled over the Malwa Sultanate, with Mandu, which you see here identified as one of its capitals, from 1401 to 1531. And the city was, at this point in time, sat at a crossroads of many different well-trafficked routes that connected southern and western littoral India. And was at one time, that is, Mandu was at one time a major political and economic center. And it essentially kind of formed a sort of cultural, linguistic, and religious nexus, which I see kind of echoed actually in the composition and illustration of the manuscript itself. So I'd mentioned that most of the figures that are depicted in the manuscript accompanying the Sultan, and by the way, the Sultans are typically always depicted with mustaches, so they're very identifiable. This is one exception where we actually have two other male figures, and they're shown, they're butchers. So there's actually a kind of, because they're preparing sort of halal, prepared butchered meats, so they are in this case gendered as male. But otherwise, most of the other illustrations, as I already mentioned, actually depict the sultans with these, what are read actually as female figures. Oftentimes it's been proposed wearing male garments, and I will, actually I won't come back to this later, I'll get to that right now. FYI, on the right, we're seeing an illustration accompanying a samosa recipe, and on the left, this is a recipe for the preparation of camphor. So to just touch briefly on the women at the Khalji court, we know actually from a 16th century text in Persian, so kind of after the fall of the Khalji dynasty, that Ghiyath-ad-Din Khalji, the father, allegedly possessed 16,000 slave girls. And it's said in this text that they were all trained in various arts of entertainment, singing, dancing, the playing of musical instruments, even reciting the Quran, and that a select number of these became intimates in the household, sharing meals with him and even partaking in official administrative duties. We also learn from this text that a small core of these women were actually Turks and Ethiopian. So these were the enslaved women coming from East African, and that they served as kind of armed retainers. Now, these numbers are probably exaggerated, 16,000, but it suggests, at least within the Khalji imaginary, that the enslaved or compelled physical labor of women figured rather prominently. And I'll come back to this point. So I just want to touch very briefly on my own experiments with this manuscript. That in spring 2022, in a course of mine, some members of a class that I taught actually cooked 2 recipes, or they had the option of selecting one, that I pulled from the Nimat Name. I had to be very careful about what I selected. It needed to be relatively easy and straightforward. So there's a kind of selection bias here. They were both rice recipes. And unusually, as compared to what we learned from the earlier presentation, we actually do get measurements that are mentioned, though not always. Sometimes it says like a pinch of something, and it's unclear exactly what that meant. But in short, to just some of the revelations or conclusions that I drew from this process. One, it was actually just fun. And it was actually fun, a kind of puzzle to figure out for the students how to translate the measurements, whether to think of them proportionally or otherwise, but also as, again, a lot of the information is not provided. There's assumed knowledge, right, that my students didn't have. I was like, you don't know to wash rice? I was kind of like hovering over them, like, you might want to wash that. But there was a lot of assumed knowledge. But also one thing that we gathered from the experience is that these recipes are actually feast-sized. They're big. It's not like for a group of 5 people. They're really meant for feasting. And again, require a certain kind of specialist knowledge. This is not really a cookbook as the Nimat Name is often described to be. So what exactly is it then? Well, I'm an art historian. One thing, and a book historian, I'll point out that this is really a luxury manuscript. It contains, again, 50 surviving illustrations created by what were highly, highly skilled artists. The calligraphy, too, is calligraphic. It's beautiful, very, very skillfully prepared. This is not a book that was likely kind of taken into the kitchen, but rather a kind of form of entertainment, courtly entertainment, but even more than that. The Nimat Name goes in quite a bit into the kind of physical and emotional ailments that the recipes may alleviate. To that end, it draws on Ayurvedic and Islamic medical knowledge and the benefits that one may accrue from then consuming these concoctions. And invariably, the text credits the royal patrons of the manuscript for this know-how. So I think more than a courtly entertainment, it is a kind of performance of a certain kind of sort of royal ethical knowledge. What we might actually more correctly say that the Nimat Name functions in the manner of a manual on court etiquette, providing instructions for what Emma Flatt calls living well. And by this, Flatt means the ethical and material practices that predominantly Persian literate royal societies of the period cultivated, brokered, and consumed, thereby producing a broadly shared courtly ethos centered on worldly, urbane knowledge and social, bodily, and cosmic control. So I'm just about out of time. I actually have and had more to say. But one of the things I just want to underscore in conclusion is that this is a manuscript, again, not really, I don't think, intended as a cookbook or used for practical use, but that really centers the Sultan and his body. And if I had more time, I would talk a bit about how some of the text actually focuses specifically on recipes that will increase his virility. So a lot of the recipes actually attend to, how to sort of increase your sexual stamina, how to maintain erections, how to increase the production of semen. And that furthermore, the women in these depictions, like the recipes, serve to kind of vitiate or soothe. And I'm happy to talk about this during a Q&A. But there's also something interesting going on in the way that the Sultan, as here dressed, or actually appearing with a kind of white body, wearing muslin, transparent, diaphanous garment, is actually conceived as being camphoricious or cooling, whereas the dark-skinned attendant or enslaved woman is actually described in the text as musky. And there's this whole sort of relationship between musk and camphor and the mixing of them. So in short, these are some of the approaches that I've found helpful to bring to my understanding of the manuscript. And with that, I'll pass the mic, the proverbial mic, to Sarah.
Thank you, Holly, for that email, because I always fangirled Holly, because I was like, oh my gosh, she's doing senses and Mughal art, and who doesn't want to be around that? So I got her email a couple weeks ago, and it's such a delight to work and know Yael. I reached out to her 5 or 6 years ago saying, hey, I'm really interested in this manuscript, and she hooked me up with all these people. So I hope and hope that by sharing all this information with you, it's a model for how you can do your research. Thank you, Brown and Holly and Finn, and it's so nice to meet you, Sylvia, we have a mutual friend, Anna Arabinden Kesson, who I have to thank. She's at Princeton. She has a beautiful, she's a wonderful professional at Princeton, and she does a wonderful organization called Art HX, which is looking at art history and colonialism in medicine, which is how we kind of came together. Before I go into this, I want to give a little bit of a background, because I think as educators, makers, as young people who are curious, or eternally young people in older bodies who are curious, it's always good to know other people's trajectories and how they come to do what they do. So, and I'm really glad I was dogged about my interests, because if I wasn't, I wouldn't be able to enjoy what I'm doing now. So background in Middle Eastern history and Arabic, lived in Israel and Palestine in the mid-90s, befriended a Bedouin family. One of the matriarchs refused to move off the land, and it was with her that I realized, okay, finish the 2 masters, but do not become a lab scientist, because I much preferred going out into the desert with her and learning about plants and the plants that she grew to take care of her herd of goats, from which she made cheese, and then the money that she made from that was hers to spend as she chose. So when I got back from doing those 2 masters, I finished it and I marched up to the New York Botanical Garden. And I was reading at that time a lot of work by Gary Paul Nabhan. He's a Lebanese American who, with my U.S. education, I had a very stereotypical notion of what it meant to be Native American. And what he did for me in writing his work was remind me and educate me about the rich traditions that Native Americans have engaged in from an agricultural perspective in this country, and what we've lost. And I was also reading the work of someone who then became my PhD advisor, Michael Balick, who's done a lot of work on what a lot of people call ethnobotany, or what I like to call the study of people and plants. And so I marched up there, and I ended up doing a lot of work in South Asia and in China, looking at Ayurveda and traditional Chinese medicine and how they treat what we call type 2 diabetes. So I basically did food studies before food studies existed, and I'm really glad I was dogged, and I'm really, so, I offer that for you to do the same. And because Yael gives such an amazing background and context, it relieves me of the obligation to do that not so well and focus more on the work that I have made that has inspired me as someone with a background in what we now call food studies, and then where I've taken it. So in the food world, and remember, your wonderful presenters here are not dealing just with secondary sources, as I often am. Even though I can read Arabic very slowly, I'm not reading massive texts in Arabic. I'm reading really good people who've translated it really well. I was reading a lot of secondary sources around this time period, and I kept on coming across very little information for most of us who do any kind of social history kind of work, of a statement that I repeat often is, the Ethiopian maidservant stabbed him to death. The Ethiopian maidservant stabbed him to death. When I came across any representations of women or the women represented, these were the kind of representations, or there was an herbalist who was probably a woman. Otherwise, these were very, as we know history is, male-centric, male-focused. So what I did is, and I also want to share with you some of the contemporary people that inspire me. Sylvia Houghteling and her visual fabulations, critical fabulations, her approach to research and history. Christina Sharp, as a U.S. citizen born in Pakistan, raised in this country, whose parents are here because of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. I owe my presence here to African American and Native American and any people fighting for acceptance and representation in this country. And so the work of Christina Sharp is very important to me. In the Wake, To Be Woke, What is Under the Wake. So I'm also from a part of the world that has deep ties to South Asia. Nation states have cut me off from Persia. Nation states have cut me off from even going to India because I was born in Pakistan and it says so on my passport. So all of these things inform my work. So the first body of work was called Undisciplined Pleasures, Vigilant Defiance. And this is the opening piece. And it's the African Indian Ocean world. And you have endows, probably sailboats that are still used today, but were manned by Arabs and most likely Africans who were maritime geniuses skilled in those things. You have a map of the world by Al-Idrisi from, I think it's 1154. Before European were map makers, the contemporary map makers, Arabs were amazing map makers. So we have a map of that world represented here in the middle, where north is south and east is west. So who's the perspective? Who's the history? Who's telling us these histories? And then we have an astrolabe. Again, an astrolabe that was probably used by the Arabs to teach the Portuguese how to sail from the east coast of Africa using the monsoon winds to get us to the west coast of South Asia. So this is the opening. And of course, I'm biased. Who doesn't love Persian clouds? So the Persian clouds that I find in the Book of Delights or the Book of Blessings, which I think is a much more expansive understanding and naming of the Nimatnama, is there. And then, of course, because I love the freedom that comes with being a maker, that the only limits are the limits of the material as opposed to the structures of a discipline. That doesn't mean it requires great discipline, but I can put, the waves that I find under Noah's Ark and an Ottoman Empire in this piece also. So again, this is how it opens. And I wanted to look at this body of work, and I'll be looking at it for quite some time. It's been 5 or 6 years, and I'm going to keep delving into it. But I wanted to, the question that I asked was, if I deleted, canceled, destroyed the Sultan, what would these femmes' lives dream into? And I'm serious and I'm playful at the same time. You know, you were talking so beautifully about recipes and fragments and what's missing. So what are those erased histories that are missing? And using my skills of fabulation, critical fabulation, I hope, and play and seriousness at the same time, seriously playful, what might they dream into? So they're not half anymore or quarter, but they're looking a bit more at us. And they are fuller, literally, I hope. So I focus on 3. I would have happily focused on 18, but I focused on 3. And the 3 women that I focus on are Queen Bilqis, also known as the Queen of Sheba, also my mother's name and perfectly intended. That she is in the middle. Razia Sultan, many of you may know of her as a very famous Muslim woman ruler who insisted on wearing men's clothing, who insisted on being called Sultan as opposed to the female Sultana. And then the third person is the last woman in the middle in green is, I was reading the work of Maza Mengiste. I happened to meet her through Dr. Deb Willis and her Women in Migration group, of which I've been a part of. And she's written a beautiful book called The Shadow King. And there's one paragraph in her book where she just lists all of the women freedom fighters, in addition to the book being about the women freedom fighters to fight against the Italian fascism in Ethiopia. And Weziro Abebach came up, and so I researched all of them, but there were these beautiful black and white photos of her from the 30s or the 40s with a rifle and a Luger, a German Luger, and she said, we must take up arms, we must learn how to use these tools, these weapons of mass destruction. And so, of course, I found a Luger on eBay, and I'll show you that in a minute, but I perched her on a Persian horse. So, undisciplined pleasures, vigilant defiance, taking care, taking pleasure, experiencing those things, but then at the same time, when called for action, when called to fight against any kind of injustices, they do. And in the catalogs, if we can get them to the library, you can read more in depth about them. This is the second iteration, 2.0. Now they're more fully frontal. And they have what I call WMDs and WMCs, weapons of mass destruction and weapons of mass creation. Do you bake or do you bludgeon? Do you poison or do you pander? Do you slice or do you sever? And these are the questions that I think a lot of us might be feeling, not just then, but now and today. Where do you put the rage? What is it when we have a tool in our hand, and how do we use it? So this is 2.0. And here are the 2 catalogs. And fast forward to last year at this time, I was at Kohler Arts Industry. They have a wonderful residency where you work in the factory alongside incredibly talented co-workers, skilled in slip cast molding. And so I did a very good thing. I took the advice of a friend who had a residency, and she said, Sada, take a basic class in slip cast molding. So I did the summer before, and it allowed me to kind of hit the ground running. And I ended up making over a ton of work, and it's not about volume, yada, yada, yada. But it was allowed me, and as a printmaker, I'm very much a printmaker. It's like, why make one when you can make 100? You just don't do that. You don't make one. It's not about the unique thing. It's about the multiplicity within the many that you make and the uniqueness of each one, what we call variable additions. So I made lugers and daggers and big talvars and small talvars and an oven. I took visual culture from my own family. So my mother has this beautiful Multani water vessel. And then there's a whole nother conversation about blue and white ware. Okay, what's the origins of blue and white ware? Well, it's very much related to Persian culture, to Chinese culture, but we get a slice of it that's only European, which is in my family's house also, a Delft vase. So I took that form and this Multani form, and I took all of the visual culture that I've created so far about these women, the foodware, the women themselves, and I reclaimed it. I made it my own. And having been trained in the quote-unquote academy, we are taught to be very, very, very objective. And I have swung all the way to the other side. I want to be highly subjective. I want to see myself in the work. I want to give other people the inspiration to do the same, to claim the cultures, to claim where you come from, and to claim the multiplicities and the diversities that are in you and put them out there. Because no one's going to do it for you except yourself. You know, James Baldwin, create the world that you want to live in. So here is one of the ovens, and you'll be seeing a few more ovens in our little workshop. You can see some of the guns in the back corner. I think I have, yes. So this says Abebach. On the other side, there's a little miniature of her, but why shouldn't a luger be covered in orange blossoms and roses with a little bit of gold leaf? What does it mean when a black or brown person has the gun as opposed to somebody else? Who is afforded humanity and who isn't? That's what I'm hoping these works can imply. Do you poison or do you pander? So each of the shiros is there, and now you get a few of them. There's amulets in there. We could go into them at another time for protection. And then this is one of the tables. So you can see the prints in the background. You can see a table is set. I took a contemporary version of a thali with the katoris and the spoon and the cup. But also there are knives. There are knives, jagged and smooth, that are hanging above. Because when you sit at my table, and probably when you sat at many tables historically, you had to beware. And there's a part of me, I'm also, when you sit at my table, you need to beware too. Because we're taught not to fear or be wary of, I'm taught to be nice, I'm taught to make you happy, I'm taught to make you feel comfortable, and I don't want to do that all the time. I want you to fear me, I want you to respect me. So when you sit at my table, you need to be aware, because a 24-karat dagger knife could fall. And I say it seriously, but I also say it playfully. Come eat at my house anytime. And then there's a very large mural that I made, and I have so many. I have to thank Yael once again, because she had me talk in her class, and this delightful young woman named Bella Achaibar came and appreciated my work and said, "Can I help you?" And she's now been working with me for over a year and a half, and a lot of this show wouldn't have happened if I didn't have someone helping me in the studio. It's not a solitary practice. It never is. Making never is. It's always a community. And so she's definitely part of my community, as are you all. But here's that African Indian Ocean world again. I grew up with the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Well, this is the Razia, the Bilqis, and the Abebach on their endows. You can't see it as well, but their patterns are there. Each of the shiros, the 3 shiros, has 2 colors, 2 patterns associated with them. I've created my own pantheon. As people often do. And the shiros are underwater. They're bearing witness. They're watching us. They're paying attention. But they're also going off in other directions. They're not just concerned about this world, but they're going off and discovering other places. And I think I'll stop there. And I'll just leave you with one of my final days at Kohler in a Mita Mastani and Sarah Khan textile, which I wanted to show Sylvia, who's going to be doing it. But it was such a joy. So here I am with all of the work behind me before it's been decaled. There is a trampoline. But to literally feel unbound and to offer that to you to feel unbound, this is what this cookbook has done for me. It has given me the space and the freedom to dream wildly, and to continue to dream wildly, and I want you all to do that here, to go forth and be your full self, unbound. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yael and Sarah. So as a group, let's pull on a few threads right now that our speakers can pick up when we break out together. So I invite comments, questions, themes that people are inspired by. Please don't be shy. There's a lot to ask about and wonder about here. Well, I will just say one thread I want to highlight is that I cursorily used the Nimat Name in my food course, and it was just so amazing to see the way you both approached aspects of it here, and I just really appreciate that. I look forward to learning a lot more. Yeah. Any other comments or questions before we move on to Sylvia's presentation? Okay, well, Yael and Sarah, thank you so much. I'm sure there'll be a lot to say in the breakout and also in the reception, which will follow the breakout. So stick around for that too.
Thank you for those amazing presentations. I'm now going to turn to Sylvia Houghteling, who is an associate professor of history of art at Bryn Mawr. She specializes in early modern visual and material culture with a focus on the history of textiles, South Asian art and architecture, and the material legacies and ruptures of European colonialism. Houghtelin's Sylvia's first book, The Art of Cloth in Mughal India, which was a recipient of a College Art Association Millard Meiss Publication Fund grant, and also the CAA's great award, the Maury Award, examined the textiles crafted and collected across the Mughal Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries, showing how woven objects helped to shape the social, political, religious, and aesthetic life of early modern South Asia. Her ongoing research is concerned with questions of temporality and the unique material histories of the Indian Ocean trade. And it's with great pleasure that I ask Sylvia to come to the podium.
Just a little bit for the color. Oh, that's awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Holly. Thank you, Finn. Thank you to Grace for organizing everyone. Thank you to these amazing talks that have gone before me, and for letting me be an interloper. I study inedible things, but maybe not for long. Maybe we can eat them. My talk today was conceived in conjunction with these remarkable courses on food, recipes, politics, and art that many of you are enrolled in right now, and draws connections between the temporality of short-lived dye materials and the foods you have been studying to think about these questions of ephemerality and duration. In the case of dyes, of course, this fragility is not usually because of wilting, spoiling, or fermenting, although that does happen, but rather because of exposure to sunlight and water. Yet dyes and foodstuffs share materials and methods of preparation. They share preservative qualities that keep intact the food or fabric they color. And on a metaphorical level, dye colors carry the evocative names of fruits, beans, and grains. Moreover, I hope by the end of my talk you might agree with me that this instability of certain dyes, their likeness to ephemeral edible things, might just be what makes them a path forward in a gentler ecology of textiles if we allow them to be. It was common in the era before the advent of chemical dyes in the 19th century that dye colors overlapped with body pigments, culinary spices, and medicinal herbs. Today I'll be focusing on dyes familiar from cooking. Turmeric, or in Hindi, haldi, a dye material from the root of the plant. Saffron, or kesar, from the precious female stigma, which you can see just right here, of the saffron crocus flower. And my favorite, safflower, or bastard saffron, which comes from the dried leaves of this, petals of this thistle-like plant, whose seeds are fed to livestock or pressed to make safflower cooking oil. All of these dye materials were typically classed in Hindi in ways that are familiar from food studies as kacha dyes, meaning raw, unripe, unready. This language aligns dyed textiles with the cycles of the natural world, where many fruits and flowers ripen to a more mellow hue over time. In Urdu and Persian, these short-lived dyes are called bikarar, a poetic word that means unsettled or restless, something that will not stand still. In English, these are termed fugitive dyes because they flee from cloth soon after they are dyed, a terminology that I think bears much exploration as well. These short-lived dyes have been overshadowed in histories of textiles by the more enduring dyes, such as indigo and cheroot red, that were used for the export trade to Europe. In studying the more fragile dyes used regionally in South Asia, we find meanings of celebration and healing, devotion and mourning that rarely surface in histories of textiles that center on the European trade. As with foodstuffs, instructional information about dyeing can be difficult to find in written texts. Historians of European dye traditions attribute this lack of early texts to a largely oral, hands-on transmission of knowledge, similar to food, within guilds or family dye workshops, and a proprietary approach that kept certain dye recipes very secretive. Dyers are also always very tied to local ecological conditions. That meant recipes and outcomes might vary across even neighboring sites. The seasonal availability of high-quality materials, or even steady sunlight, which helps to bleach white cloth or brighten newly dyed colors. The mineral composition of water sources is another crucial consideration when dyeing, and I should say when baking and cooking. In the 17th century, for instance, it was the waters of India's southeastern Coromandel coast, which were calcium-rich because of decomposing seashells, that deepened the famous red dyes of export textiles. Dyes make visible what is often hinted at through the sense of taste. Rajarshi Sengupta has recorded that contemporary dyers in this same region of the Coromandel coast used a sensory vocabulary for the perfect mixture of the sweet or fresh waters and the salty river waters that they used to achieve precise dye colors. Questions of temporality also require a certain amount of creativity, as we just discussed, when engaging recipes from the past through reworking, a word for processes of making objects based on past instructions that acknowledges, in ways that the word reproduction or replication do not, this very active back and forth process for using past recipes. For instance, when historian Jenny Bulbulay reworked the recipe for Burgundian black dye, and this is a wonderful project that I'll just direct you to, readily available online. The 16th century recipe stated that a cloth should be heated in the dye vat for the length of 3 to 4 paternosters, or the Lord's Prayer. Bulbulay found a Latin recitation of the prayer and a Dutch translation, and was then able to approximate the number of minutes the recipe required. This amazing 17th century German dye recipe book, now at the Getty Research Library, is more precise about time. Not in this image, but in others, it contains swatches of, or all the images contain swatches of dyed wool to show its user how the color will develop as the cloth is submerged for 1 hour, 2 hours, and more, and by using materials of varying expense, which is what's shown here. Though even more rare, the British Library holds one set of dye recipes from South Asia, dating to the late 17th or early 18th century, that is contained in a broader compilation of medical and artisanal knowledge, known as the Quintessence of Prescriptions. Other chapters in the volume address treatments for horses and for earaches, recipes for perfumes, and instructions for marbling paper. The dyer's recipes are written in Persian, likely for a North Indian audience, and the volume contains the date of 1766, although the original text may have been written earlier. H.K. Naqvi, the first scholar to publish on this set of recipes in the 1960s and 70s, noted that the recipes include hands-on descriptions for how to grind materials and the cloth that should be used to strain them. The dyeing instructions call for common materials that would be available in a kitchen: a copper pot, sour lemons, along with more specific dye materials that were likely purchased, such as the best quality indigo or Nil Qasa. Essential materials of the dyer, such as myrobalan fruit, also appeared in medicinal treatments, drawing the dyer's recipes close to the book's other prescriptions for healing the body and crafting perfumes. The lists of dye colors capture some of the most brilliant and quickly fading hues achieved by early modern dyers: mungbean green and pomegranate blooms, natural materials that have long since lost their freshness, even more quickly than the brilliant pink and greens of the natural dyer's palette. Other recipes evoke more subdued hues, the color of poppy seed, or flour made from gram or ground chickpeas. The recipes are also a reminder of how similar to cooking the preparations for dyeing could be. The color of green pistachios, sub pistae, for instance, the recipe instructs the dyer to soak turmeric, referred to by the Persian zartupe in this text, in water overnight, and then to peel the skin with a knife, something I was easily able to replicate, and I have some upstairs. The turmeric root is then mashed with water and strained, something we can do together. The fabric is then dipped in the turmeric 4 times, dried between each submersion. And that's a really interesting and important quality that a lot of these recipes have, to dry the cloth between submersions. And then finally dipped in a solution made from boiling dried pomegranate rinds, and then to dry it once more. The recipes make a clear distinction between short-lived or long-lasting dyes, using these terms bikarar or bikarari and karari, which means fixed or stable, which we see here. One of these short-lived dyes, furgul ereanar, a color like the pomegranate flower, contains just 3 ingredients: turmeric, safflower, indicated by the Persian shahabi khasa in this recipe book, and the juice of the sour lemon. It's an approximate recipe that we can also try to rework upstairs, which, like culinary instructions, leaves much up to taste, particularly for the sour lemons. The more acid you use in a safflower bath, the more orangey the color. The dyer could choose just how biting to make this pomegranate flower color, which I have here. The recipe states that the cloth dries in the shade. One would never dry a safflower textile in the sun, as it would already begin to fade. And this last point about drying in the shade is why experimenting with textile colorants like the safflower is so important. Without seeing the cloth emerge from my own very amateur experiments, this was the first time I dyed with safflower, I would never have believed that the dried petals of the safflower could impart to silk, linen, and cotton such a spectrum of shocking pink colors, whose fluorescence would seem to have only come from modern chemical dyes. Guild regulators in France generally banned safflower for anything besides ribbons and bindings, because the pigment is prone to such quick fading, as I quickly discovered when I dyed silk in safflower, and it faded after just 3 days in the sun. Cotton and linen retain their color longer, although these cloths that I dyed with Bryn Mawr students last spring were wonderfully pink, and then dispiritingly pale after I just left them sitting for 1 week in my office in the partial shade. Despite this fading, though, scientific dye analysis conducted at the Metropolitan Museum of Art on a collection of Persian and Indian silk velvet textiles from the 16th and 17th century, and I should say these are the most valuable textiles of this period. They're made with gold and silver threads, huge quantities of silk. It was found that there was an extensive use of safflower and turmeric. These chemical markers appeared on nearly all of the pink and orange threads used in the lush velvet piles of these velvets, and turmeric was used for the majority of yellow threads in the Indian velvets. What now appear to be rather pale yellow flowers and dull purples were once pulsating magenta and hot pink. Perhaps understanding that the colors would fade, consumers, and these royal consumers, simply enjoyed the first flush of bright pink, and then the move to more subdued salmon colors that we really associate with, particularly with Safavid textiles, over time. Given their delicacy and their relatively low value, by contrast, the cotton textiles that dyed these materials often do not remain. As part of my project, I returned to archival evidence I had collected at the Rajasthan court of Amar Jaipur, shown here in Rajasthan, in their rangkhane, or their dyeing workshop, and found that haldi, or turmeric, kesar, or saffron, and kusum, or safflower, recur in the expenditure documents of the dye workshop. The Amar records also show that garments colored with these pigments were most frequently gifted in the springtime and early summer, particularly these popular times for weddings. So knowing this, we might look at a corpus of Rajasthani paintings from the nearby court of Udaipur, where images of wedding processionals depict garments that I think were likely dyed with haldi or turmeric, a continuing pre-wedding tradition that continues today. Because haldi carries not only this rich scent and this warm color and rich scent, but has known health properties for the skin and antimicrobial effects. The 1730s representation of the marriage feast of Prince Jagat Singh II is filled with celebrants wearing streaked haldi-dyed garments. The presence of the dye is made so palpable when it's seen dripped and smeared on the clothing, or when it swirls on this woman's ghagra skirt. The color seems to spread between the celebrants, perhaps rendering in a way that the facial expressions do not, this sensory experience of festivity. In other words, the dyes might communicate what scholar Deepa has written about as the mood or pav of the wedding processional. In the case of leheria textiles, a word that means wavy from the word leher for waves, safflower, the dye, was used to color these textiles that ushered in the monsoon. An early 18th century portrait of Maharaja Gaj Singh, the first of Jodhpur, depicts the ruler in this characteristically zigzaggy, wavy pattern. And this is what we're going to be trying to rework in our workshop upstairs. The textile is made using an intricate tie-dyeing process, a simpler of which version we'll try. When the color has been tied into a turban and worn as a shawl, though, the lines jostle and shift and the colors ripple over each other. The dye colors used to add hue to these textiles added further mutability. The finest leheria turbans and shawls were first dyed in indigo and turmeric for the blue, green, and yellow, and then were dip-dyed 8 to 10 times in safflower. It was the textiles made with these short-lived kacha safflower dyes that were prized in the monsoon season. Only widows and those without means had their cloths dyed in the longer-lasting red al dyes, a sort of rusty red color known as the paka or stable, steady dyes. When the safflower-dyed turbans and shawls were worn in the rain to celebrate the monsoon festival of Tej, the raw kacha pink dyes on the textiles became wet and the dye flowed down the body, releasing the color into the water. There was a poetry to this experience of a textile's color draining into the river that had devotional resonance as well, imagined in paintings as a spreading of the intense love of Krishna's devotees out into the environment. Safflower is still used today in Rajasthan to overdye textiles and to refresh their color. In this 20th century turban from Jodhpur that I own, I was able to use a UV light to see the remnants of safflower petals. And this is the amazing thing about safflower is because it's literally fluorescent, you can see it under UV light. And you can see these little remnants of the safflower petals. In the 19th century, British manufacturers tried to emulate the leheria or pattern in aniline dyes to sell in India, and we can see that down here. The jagged fixedness of the color of the British-made cloth cannot ever approach the lapping waves of the original. With its thick, saturated, likely synthetic colors, this imitation cloth is also a reminder that the dyes used to make it, likely from coal tar byproducts, and this is how aniline dyes or synthetic dyes start to be made in the 19th century. These dyes have so disastrously polluted rivers worldwide. Unlike the perishable flower petals and root powders that I've been discussing today, toxic chemical dyes and heavy metallic mordants remain indelibly in our waterways and also in our blood systems. Moreover, it is not just that these perishable dyes that we've been talking about do not harm our bodies or our environment. They might even have health benefits. And this raises the important point that dyes may have been used for properties beyond their color. I've recently studied how many of the short-lived dyes we've been discussing today were historically used in preserving manuscripts in South and Southeast Asian libraries. And I know the class yesterday discussed edible and inedible, edible and poisonous parts of manuscripts. Turmeric is often used as a yellow dye for both the threads that tie the palm leaf manuscripts, such as this one in the Brown collections, or as a paste to protect fragile leaves, and also as the dye for wrapping cloths, for the same reason that it protects and is antifungal for the manuscripts. The red dyes, as we were discussing upstairs, wards away insects. Henna, which is used to dye paper a very pleasing tan color, and I must recommend this article. It's terrific. Also, lots of information about colorants for paper, not just for cloth. But it's been found by Mandana Barkeshli to have, in her amazing recent experiments, to keep away mold. So recent food and textile research has also shown that pomegranate rinds, which can produce a whole range of kind of greens to browns, to yellowish greens, that pomegranate dyes made from pomegranate rinds contain powerful antioxidants. Powdered pomegranate rinds are a completely natural and effective food preservative. And get this, fabric dyed with pomegranate rinds have natural deodorizing properties infused into the cloth. Our conversation today has also made me excited about studying a couple of recipes I've seen that use spices to not just color cloth, a sort of brown color, but really to imbue them with scent. So how might it change our perception of our clothing, what we wear on our bodies, to think that so many dyes that were once used were also natural preservatives and safe to eat to bring inside our bodies. On a pedagogical level, as we'll find in our workshops today, it means that we can experiment with these materials safely in the classroom. When I prepare for workshop sessions, I use my own pots and my kitchen fills with this creamy smell of turmeric and the steam of hibiscus. I largely do not use metallic mordants made from alum, tin, or iron, which would fix the color, but make the dyes harsher on waterways and our skin. As such, these are materials that are safe for all of us, even kids, my kids, to stir and handle. It seems a rather cruel irony that while the polyesters of fast fashion, the dye chemicals and microfibers that they release into the water will persist forever, the textiles we're discussing today had already begun their disappearance short years after they were made. Clauses like these point to the critical difference between what we now call disposable objects, plastic forks, polyester caps, and perishable objects like these textiles, almost all of which, with the exception of those preserved in arid places, have already essentially biodegraded. In the end, this is in some ways a model to take for years to come. Perhaps it's best for generations after us if they find the meaning of our contemporary and future clothing not in the mountains of cast-off objects or the water filled with aniline dyes, but instead in the recipes that we leave behind. So, thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Sylvia. That was excellent. Any themes or questions to highlight for Sylvia before we break out? I know everyone's looking forward to that, but yes.
Were any fabrics incompatible with laundering?
Interesting question. Okay, great. So that's something to talk about. I'm curious about that myself. Yeah. Any other themes? Yeah, David.
I was just thinking, you were talking about the dyes where the dye itself fades. Is there any issue around dyes that actually degrade the underlying fibers?
Interesting. Very cool. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, the zero. Please.
You spoke about the kacha and the karar, bekarar, but what about the karar and the pakka? And thinking about breads, so beets, just curious.
Excellent. Yeah, another great dye stuff for sure. Well, Holly, do you want to join me up here and we can talk about the next phase? Right? So we got. I think that we have 3 different breakouts, right? And Sylvia's dyeing will be in the North Common Room on the 2nd floor, and Sarah and Yael will be in the South Common Room on the 2nd floor, working with ovens and paper. And Andrea and Deepa will be in the boardroom, which is right here on the floor here. And for those who registered in advance, go to the place you registered for. If you didn't, no worries. I think we've had a lot of no-shows.
Yeah,
right?
so what I wonder is maybe those in Sylvia's group could come to this side, and Sylvia, you could lead with one of us to your session.
Or maybe even find your leaders outside, so it's easy.
Yeah, or you can find your leaders outside.
Would that be easier?
Is that easier? Yeah.
Maybe so. Do you mind, Sylvia, leading and our various speakers?
Okay. Yeah. And then so Andrea's group.
Yeah.
In the center, and Yael and Sarah.
Excellent.
On the left.
Thank you all so much. Big round of applause.
And just to echo our thanks to the Saxena Center and to Grace and Armand for their great help.
Yes, Grace, Armand, thank you guys so much.